Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this specific session that treats the curatorial within the frame, within the context of the 2020. The title of the session is Bare and Cracked Open. And I'm delighted to welcome two persons whose practice I admire professionally a lot, Paul O'Neill and Michael Birchall. Welcome to the session. I will start by reading some of your specific data from your biographies, but later on in the less conventional part of the session, I will have a more personal take on what your practices mean in my curatorial parcours. So Dr. Paul O'Neill is an Irish curator, artist, writer, and educator. He is the artistic director of Publix, a position he took up in September 2017. Publix is a curatorial agency and event space with a dedicated library and reading room in Helsinki. Between 2013 and 2017, he was director of the graduate program at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College, New York. He is author of the critically acclaimed book, The Culture of Curating and the Curating of Cultures, Cambridge, Massachusetts, the MIT Press, published in 2012, which has been translated into many languages. His most recent co-edited book is Curating After the Global Roadmaps to the Present, is published with MIT Press in 2019. Paul is widely regarded as one of the foremost research-oriented curators and leading scholar of curatorial practice, public art, and exhibition histories. Paul has held numerous curatorial and research positions over the last 20 years, and he has taught on many curatorial and visual arts programs in Europe and the UK. Paul has co-curated more than 60 curatorial projects across the world, including amongst recent others. We are the epicenter at P Gallery, New York, and multifaceted, we are the Center for the Curatorial Studies for the Hassel Museum Bard College in 2016 and 2017, and the Symposium Curating After the Global at Luma Foundation Arles 2017, with the cited commission for the Emmanuel Lenné. Paul's writing has been published in many books, catalogs, journals, and magazines. He is a reviews editor for Art and the Public Sphere Journal, and on the editorial boards of the Journal of the Curatorial Studies and Field, a journal of socially engaged art criticism, and the Journal of Curatorial Studies. He is editor of the curatorial anthology Curating Subjects and co-editor of Curating and the Educational Turn and Curating Research, both with Mike Wilson, and co-published by De Appel and the Open Editions Amsterdam and London. Locating the Producers, Durational Approaches to Public Art, published in Amsterdam in 2011. He also co-edited with Claire Doherty, and author of the critically acclaimed book, The Culture of Curating and the Curating of Cultures, published by the MIT Press in 2012. So we are absolutely delighted that we can have you in this panel, which is a modest panel, but I hope that it will be meaningful to all participants, and that together we will be able to contribute to the more equal art world. So Paul, welcome. The floor is all yours, the proverbial floor.
Thank you very much, Maja, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody, in the virtual digital platform world. I'm going to try and share my screen with you. And I will read a text for you with some images playing in the background. The text is called Thinking Like a Para-Host. Can you all hear me okay? How institutions think is an issue of fundamental contemporary importance. and one that needs to be addressed from multiple perspectives and with a new sense of urgency as appears apparent here today and elsewhere. Culture and its publics is always plural as a concept, as a contested site, as a space of production and critique, and as a vast array of discourses and institutions in different parts of the world. In this sense, then, public cultures are many times and many places. It is local and global, here and now, then and now. The teaching and learning of culture, as much as the studying of its disciplines, such as dance, visual arts, design, theatre, literature, performance, music, architecture, all in their multiple forms, more widely, needs to continually question the dynamics between politics, education, research, artistic practices, and their institutions. A rethinking of these relations is necessary both within and beyond the academy and art institutional walls if we are to expand our comprehension of this present situation in time, so that we can reimagine relations between the local and the global, regional and national presence during a moment of increased inequality and political fragility for human rights across Europe and the world. This is a time of increased discrimination, structural violence, and civic uncertainty. There is a desperate anxiety for those of us, like me, who actually believe in the values and merits of art, its education, its institutional forms, and the agency and ability of art in its many diverse forms to critique, transform, and impact the world in which we live. One of the biggest institutional challenges we have is to make contemporary artistic practices more relevant to society so that they can play a significant role in challenging the many prejudices associated with difference and otherness, race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, and to make our contemporary present more vital to the future. In recent decades, certainly within cultural discourses, we have seen much debate over institutional critique, new institutionalism, instituent practices, and self-organization. Most often, these issues of institution have been apprehended through the categories of power, hegemony, hierarchy, control, value, and discipline. Typically, in these debates, we seem to reach an impasse in the contemporary dialectic of institutionalized anti-institutionalism. This is instead now, it is important to look at propositions rather than reactions in a period of radical uncertainty and reactive securitizing control for us to imagine the situation in new non-polarizing ways beyond increasingly anachronistic and narrow geopolitical terms. In Mary Douglas's 1986 social anthropological work, How Institutions Think, she sought to expand upon and imagine the numerous contemporary possibilities for and limitations of institutional formats, practices, and imaginaries. In the book, How Institutions Think Between Contemporary Art and Curatorial Discourses, which I co-edited with Lucy Stees and Mick Wilson, we employed Douglas's work using her title and some of her arguments, both as a political statement and as a loose framing device with which to look at new thinking on institution. In particular, I am interested in how Douglas describes how different kinds of institutions allow individuals to think different kinds of thought and to experience diverse emotions. She writes, for better or worse, individuals really do share their thoughts, and they do so to some extent harmonize their preferences, and they have no other way to make big decisions except within the scope of institutions they build. End of quote. In reminding us that individual cognition is socially controlled, Douglas emphasizes our responsibility for the thinking we produce through the institutions we take part. Clear-sighted in her vision and what is entailed in what is at stake in the process of rethinking institution, Douglas acknowledges that solidarity is only gesturing when it involves no sacrifice. Hence, she poses for us the question, how are we to build and sustain institution for art that equip ourselves and others to be aware of our inherent contradictions and yet still be able to make big decisions. Douglas is less a foreboding omnipresence than a proximate spectre in my thinking, and taking up her theory of institution being a social construct, we might begin to state that thinking itself is dependent upon institutions. We cannot think without them. Think institution, however critically we imagine ourselves to be thinking, we are already implicated in an institutionalizing process and are formed or even confined by our experience of institution. Proceeding from this point, we might hope to reconsider the practices, habits, models, revisions, and rhetorics of institution and anti-institution in contemporary cultural discourses by considering themes of epistemic practice, of cognition and social bond, of power, knowledge, and of institution as an object of inquiry across multiple disciplines, including political theory, organizational science, and sociology. Some of the questions in need of further address include: is institutional building still possible, feasible, or desirable? Are there emergent future institutional models for progressive art and research practices? How do we legitimate or challenge institution without taking them down? How do acts of constituting become the acts of instituting? How do we know when institutions make decisions and whether their decisions are built upon ethical principles? How can we institute ethical principles and build institutions accordingly? If so, for whom are we building these future institutions? In what ways can we think extra-institutionally, contra-institutionally, non-institutionally, para-institutionally? How serious are we really when we claim to wish to build our future institutions together? Pedagogical or curatorial institutions such as the Art Academy, the museum, the gallery, the theatre are institutionally entwined. But more widely, I've been asking myself, what is the institutional basis for art exhibition, its experience, production, and discussion in the public sphere? It is needed to look at all forums or hubs that operate over time to sustain art's capacity to question, provoke, and inspire people in general, whilst defending the value of the cultural voice distinct from government and commerce. This means that we traverse the institutional field from museum to the artistic collective, from the art academy to the research network, and from privately funded to state-sponsored, all while foregrounding cross-cutting initiatives. The tradition of curatorial developments, certainly within West and Eastern Europe and North America, would conventionally point us toward a trajectory for and around art that starts with institutional critique in, say, the late 1960s and into the 1970s, then progresses to artist-activist interventions in the 1980s and experiments in curatorial institutionalism in the 90s, with alternative spaces, self-organizations, and instituent practices that reject formation, increasingly treading their way in between and beyond as we move into the next century. The rise of the creative or cultural industries in the 2000s and indeed algorithmic institutions that respond to logical capitalism and are therefore only nominally public brings us up to the present moment. This is a brief history of institutional critique to this moment now. While this trajectory has the merit of having been tested over the past years, it excludes as much as it includes and does not account for the ways in which already invented institutional types might suddenly offer themselves for full or partial revival under new circumstances at almost every moment. Allowing histories and forms of institution to be reimagined must be done in tandem with any mapping of new possibilities that present themselves in our current conditions. Hearing and learning from specific places and practices that are perhaps less well known and can also offer some ways forward. It's useful to retain a productive tension between any attempts to rethink the historical modernist project as anchored in Europe and our post-Euro colonial times, and the work of demodernizing or looking elsewhere for anchors and historical mirrors that might inform institutions as they go forward. This tension is arguably one of the most important reasons why it would be foolish to attempt to pin down a single institutional history that would inevitably reify certain practices or contingent decisions, whilst ignoring a wider field of political, commercial, and globalizing pressures that force the hand of many institutional actors. For this reason, we should enable a breadth of positions rather than any fixed conclusions about thinking institutionally and institutional thinking. With reference to the work of Chantal Mouffe to represent agonistic pluralism as a form of learning from each other, and to appropriate the words of Ludwig Fleck via Mary Douglas in her book, we could aim to build what he calls a thought collective, where such a phenomena being most simply understood as a community or constituency of persons mutually exchanging ideas and maintaining intellectual interaction. As a call to reflect upon how institutional practices inform art, curatorial, educational, and research practices, as much as how they shape the world around us, it is essential to implement a work-together methodology combining and sharing networks and knowledge resources. We might begin then to conceptualize and build possible institutions and anti-institutions. At the same time, to be very wary of how any collective can itself verge upon institutionalization. So it is important to bring in new partners, voices, and thinkers to our institutions at all times, regardless of how conflictual or divergent they may be on their own or to our own. More than considering how institutions think at present, we might ask questions such as, what are the models, resources, skills, and knowledge needed to develop such progressive, innovative research institutions? Is such a thing possible? Will it ever be? Can it be realized in tandem with its publics, its collaborators, its guests? Obviously, I believe that with such a model remains a real potentiality and is something that we've been trying in Helsinki with publics. And the images that you've seen in the background are maybe tracing a recent history of publics over the last 3 years, but also showcasing some of the events that I want to talk very briefly about. Publics is an evolving cooperative research-based art project enacted together with others in public, in practice as a critical mode of listening, sharing, and being open to a decolonizing of what we think we know by supporting the curatorial needs of others. More than ever, we need to look after each other, one another, and to take care of ourselves. So how can this spirit of care constitute a productive way of working together institutionally, organizationally, curatorially? And one concrete way that we've been doing this is through our para-hosting program at Publics, which began in 2018 and has grown into a key method of decentering authorship, of self-critiquing Publics' own elective curatorial agency. As a para-host, Publics offers its space, its staff, its resources, time, knowledge, and funding to provide support for the curatorial ideas of others and to para-host their initiatives who are in need of space to practice and support the realization of their projects publicly, and who do not have the resources to do so. Public continues to host other peoples, other bodies, and their ideas, and allow its identities to be taken over by them. And on so many levels, we become preoccupied by our guests. Public takes care of its parasites, its para-institutions, its para-guests. Its space continues to become increasingly the workshop of other curatorial initiatives. This is also realized alongside our own curatorial program in a way, but para-hosting is now the fold or the blurring between the boundaries of what's para-hosting and what's our own curatorial program has become increasingly less clear. Para-hosting is a flexible, evolving, expanding, and sometimes messy program of residencies, of talks, of performances, and discursive events. And although now it has a full list of protocols to adhere to, it often culminates in multiple educational formats and hybrid exhibition forms with many different levels of cooperation and co-production. Para guests have stayed with us for a day or a year, where we do what is needed to make their proposals possible. Each guest brings with them different needs, expectations, diverse ideas, and often divergent publics. Its para-hosting program, Publics, began in September 2018, where we looked at labor with an organization called Wasted, which was our first para-hosting program, where they proposed to us to take over Publics as a rehearsal space for a collective form of theatre, to question and to look at different forms of labor, and more specifically, how work life would be, what work life would be if we were to view it through the lens of sustainability and care. As I've said, the question of care has since the beginning of Publics also been one of the key operative principles and led to nourish together long-term relationships, such as working with the artist Jana van Heeswijk, which we're doing currently on a project called The Already Not Yet, whose practice is rooted in the framework of togetherness and commitment. So we can often think about care in a straightforward act where the carer is simply looking after or taking care of things and people, but caring is also an uneasy thing, full of weight, often distressed and disproportionately unbalanced, where collective caretaking holds multi-tenuous desires, some often shared whilst others not fully tangible yet. Sarah Ahmed, when writing in her book Strange Encounters, they say, I was very interested there in the everyday way in which an individual body moves, and not the same as some bodies are always more comfortable than others. An institutional body is composed of elements, an individual external evaluations, emerging talents, and those who we call the pioneers, success stories and failed projects. They reside next to smaller units equally vital to us. When our body maintains the structure that supports the system, cells are building blocks. One can argue if the existing structure can be challenged through short-term experiments and timescales. And I mentioned Wasted because it was the first project at Publics, but also it really stretched the limits of what was possible because Publics couldn't do its work. And in a way, Wasted became Publics for 6 weeks. And then eventually we shifted into another gear. Another example of this evolution for Publics is a long-term project with Shimmer in Rotterdam, where we began by hosting a small exhibition of 3 sculptures by the artist Gordon Hall at Publics, alongside a performative live reading of Gordon's writing with Gordon and with Eloise Sweetman and Jason Hendrik Hanse from Shimmer, in parallel to Shimmer's evolving exhibition involving Gordon's work in Rotterdam. So these 2 small exhibitions took place simultaneously in Helsinki at Publics and in Shimmer in Rotterdam. And through an extended dialogue between us about listening and reading aloud, this para-hosting of Shimmer as an institution for 1 whole year at Publics expanded into a project called Across the Way With, as a co-selected and expanding series of informal readings of, with, and about intimacy in the public realm, with readings by invited readers from across the world. In a way, the project originates at Shimmer's idea, but it is co-programmed, and together we are thinking about the texture of the voice, the rhythm of the body, the poetic and artistic forms of writing, and how these forms of intimacy can be voiced publicly. Together, we have hoped to create a space that is both public and intimate, digital and analog, distant and in proximity. I can share a link with all of you after this, where all of the video readings are on an online platform. We created an online platform as a support structure for the act of reading aloud for others and with others, and which we were planning already before the current pandemic, but somehow it seemed more timely now. For the audience, it is the intimate act of being read aloud to to experience the intimate texture of the voice, the rhythm of breathing, the digitalized voice streaming to you. In this way, rather than creating a reading group for discussion, we created a space for the phone in the pocket heard at work, in the kitchen, or on the laptop taken to bed. Across the Way With is a resource, a place available to contemplate, to flesh out the possibilities of access, and as a site that goes beyond our individual networks and our physical and spatial limitations. So in a way, para-hosting, this is one of many of over 20 para-hosting projects we've done in the last 3 years. And para-hosting is a practice of doing something other than, beside, outside, or auxiliary to, and operating at a distance from the main act of curating exhibitions. Through acts of listening and taking care of para-hosts, para-guests, para-sites, and para-institutions, para-hosting is an essential means of working together without boundaries or containment. It's proposed as being central to how we can work without prioritizing our own authorship, and as a progressive terrain for organizational praxis that both operates within the curatorial paradigm and retains a destabilizing relationship to it via paratexts, sites, works, and institutions. In this sense, para-hosting is a useful term to describe transitional temporal processes of engagement with people taking precedence over exhibitions or productions as the primary end product of curatorial endeavors. In the face of such a reductive scenario, para-hosting proposes an evolving field of operations that persist in resisting the established order of things as part of the destabilizing curatorial constellation.
Thank you, Paul. This was a very profound presentation of the practices, and because your practice is so wide, but this was a very specific angle to it. I have a couple of questions. I would leave them for a discussion. I would also like to encourage the audience to raise questions in the comments or publicly, openly, when we finish with the second presentation. So now I would like to welcome Dr. Michael Birchall, who is a curator at Migros Museum of Contemporary Art in Zurich, Switzerland. From 2016 to 2020, he was curator of public practice at Tate Liverpool and senior lecturer at Liverpool School of Art and Design. At Tate Liverpool, he developed exhibitions and projects with a range of artists, including Christopher Klein's OK, the musical in 2017, Sarah Brown's Against Ordinary Language in 2017, and Annika Eriksson's Animal in 2019. And he also co-curated Tate Liverpool's collection Rehang. Birchall has also led on public, program, and research-based projects, including the Keith Haring Foundation residency with the artist Patrick Staff and the conference Keith Haring, Art and Activism in 1980s, New York. Birchall studied art history, history, and curating, and obtained a PhD from the University of Wolverhampton. In 2019, he participated in Stonewall's LGBT leadership program. He previously held curatorial appointment at the Western Front, Vancouver, Canada, the Walter Phillips Gallery at the Banff Center, also in Canada, and Kunstlerhaus Stuttgart in Germany, where he co-curated the exhibition Stuttgart, How Are You Doing in 2011. He has edited numerous catalogs and journals and contributed to a wide range of publications, including Institution as Praxis, New Curatorial Directions for Collaborative Research, published by Stenberg Press in 2020. Tate Papers, Arc and Bulletin, and co-edited the Journal on Curating's issue After the Turn, Art Education Beyond the Museum, 2014. Congratulations on your new appointment at the Migros Museum, Michael, and welcome to the session.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you to Paul for that really thorough presentation. I certainly took a lot of notes. Mine is less formal than Paul's and more of a collection of thoughts that I put together after Maja and I had a conversation, as the title of the panel is Stripped Down and Cracked Open, the Curatorial Paradigm in 2020. I think it's time to offer some reflections, really, particularly in light of how we see public engagement in the sort of age of the pandemic that we're living through. Although I think, like most of us, I'm quite bored of talking about the pandemic because it seems to be omnipresent. So as Maja mentioned, I am curator at Migros Museum, where I lead the program of contemporary art. And prior to this, I was at Tate, which I would say taught me a great deal about how large-scale institutions present modern and contemporary art to audiences and seek to engage visitors in a multitude of ways depending on the level of engagement. My current function at the museum is to commission contemporary art projects and exhibitions with artists. I also work on research, public programs and catalogue production. And I must say that I work with a team of education public program curators, a collection curator and various assistants. We usually deliver approximately 3 to 4 exhibitions annually. And alongside this, we have 2 to 3 exhibitions of our permanent collection. And it's one of the most unique things I think about the Migros Museum is that it also collects from its exhibition history. So we often have the opportunity to produce works with artists, and then these works join the permanent collection, which offers a great sort of reflection on the institution's history. And actually, right now, we're working on our program in the next 2 years. And it's very interesting to see what we bought during that time and how, if you look at from the 1980s onwards, where this really maps particular moments within artistic production. So I would say that over the last decade, the ways in which that the Public Art Museum has encapsulated models of public engagement and new models of instituting has allowed for a range of practices to develop that may extend beyond the museum and also into areas of public practice. This has coincided with a renewed interest in social engagements through artist-led projects that permeate beyond the museum's walls. It is crucial to acknowledge that in the practice of curating, this has moved into one of discourse, that is, activities taking place inside museums and galleries and other cultural organizations that seek to generate new knowledge with and for audiences. Artists and curators who are involved in the delivery of art activities in the context of the museum do this in the form of knowledge providing or pedagogical programs, which may not produce art objects. It seems to be the obsession of the museum to collect art objects and to present art objects, but this is certainly not the case for all forms of artistic production in the current time. And I think the projects that Paul mentioned at Publix really speak to this particular moment. And of course, one could say that the performance turn which has occupied museums in the last 10 years is certainly about engaging audiences in witnessing or being part of various performances inside the gallery. However, in this repurposed role, the artist becomes a researcher. They're often involved in both strategies to increase participation and knowledge production. Their practice is no longer about the studio as an object-making mission, but rather to a form of planning, one that is usually associated with that of the museum educator. In this model, artistic and curatorial practices interact with the pedagogical function and become delinked from their institutional associations. Now, if we think about what's happened in the last year, I would say that museums have increasingly moved towards online programs, or they've stopped producing various projects at all. I would say that we've had various ways of engaging audiences in technology for quite a long time, but this has never really been truly explored. I think that large institutions have not provided sufficient online content, and they've really struggled to attract audiences. This is due to a lack of an investment in technology, and also the fact that museums are reliant on visitors to come into the museum, to purchase tickets, to buy coffee or whatever, and thus contribute to the sustainability of the institution. However, I think in the current year, it's also been the moment of the small institution. Many small institutions that I have been watching or been part of their online programs has been of particular interest. In the UK, organisations such as Bluecoat in Liverpool, Studio Voltaire in London, and also the ICA in London have developed specific projects that only manifest online and also target specific audiences. In my own institution, we have really learned a different way of operating in terms of how our public program works. So it's quite conventional. Our public program is a complementary program of events, which usually includes talks by various people, artists, experts, etc. And I would say that within the context of Zurich, it's often quite a challenge to attract audiences to attend talks, because you're somewhat competing with other organizations in Zurich, and you really have to be careful about the events that you plan and when and where that they take place. However, moving this to an online platform has really widened the reach immensely. So whereas a talk would have maybe, I don't know, 80 people attend, now we're seeing like up to 300 guests. And this is certainly a direction that I think will be taking the public program into the future, because this certainly widens the intellectual reach of the exhibition. However, from my perspective, the problem is that if we're still producing exhibitions that are reliant on objects and or knowledge production, how do we try to present this in various forms to audiences who cannot attend the exhibition? However, maybe many of you here also, like me, experience art from different contexts through online media. This is how we get to look at various ways of displaying art, or also tapping into different conversations. I also think this particular moment is linked in the changes to the position of the curator and perhaps the curatorial. As curators, we produce exhibitions that are reliant on our expert knowledge in various disciplines. When we don't have a particular area of expertise, we will tap into other academics. And this knowledge is transferred to audiences in displays and other various ways of presenting ideas, as I mentioned before, such as talks, etc. However, it is through this knowledge transfer that we enter into a conversation with our audiences. And in my own practice, I see this as being quite reflective. Once the hang or the installation is complete in the traditional sense, this is not the end of the process, but rather the beginning to enter into a conversation with publics through public program activities. In an artist that I'm working with now on a new exhibition, we just had a conversation this morning about what this will look like next year, but I'm part of their journey. I'm part of their research process. We are exchanging text, ideas, and this will ultimately allow us to produce this exhibition. However, a lot of that research process or that sharing that occurs within the early stages of an exhibition process, this is often hidden to audiences. So I'm always looking for ways that we can tap into this research process and also share particular texts or writers or artists that also become part of this work, really. And, ultimately, exhibitions that we produce are about educating audiences, and we should learn from this encounter. This is for me, the reason why we're interested in artistic production. This is a way to enter into different dialogues internationally. This is how we can be exposed to various ideas that challenge our own perceptions as well. And I would say that throughout the last decade, it's pedagogical projects that have taken on a public and a civil societal role, given the cuts in education and cuts within state provision to the arts. And thus, the growth of self-organized structures outside of mainstream institutions have convened as sites of alternative learning, such as Open School East in London, to mention an example, inadvertently collapsing the divisions between formal and non-formal sites of education, such as creative practice, performance, and activism. When knowledge production becomes the focus of activities in the art world, it also becomes a field of critical potentiality and a potential place for exchange. And it's this exchange that occurs between the artist, the public, the museum, and perhaps the curator. This for me is of specific interest. I also think as a institutional curator, which is certainly the background that I have, we are often invisible. We're often not sort of presented as the sort of collaborator or contributor to an exhibition or to a project. We're often working behind the scenes. A lot of the work that we do can be quite technical and administrative. However, we are part of this development of ideas, but we're often, you know, in our offices or hiding upstairs, and we're not visible to a public that is coming to see a exhibition. You know, I also think that my position is quite privileged. I am able to develop exhibitions in quite a well-resourced institution. This is certainly not the case for many of my colleagues that work internationally. And one of the benefits, or rather one of the opportunities here, is that we are often presenting ideas to new audiences and to make various conversations and ideas visible. And I think in order to do this, we have to have an engagement with other contexts. We have to develop relationships with smaller scale institutions internationally, and these also might be led by artists. I think there's often great ways that you can work with different audiences if you bring in different collaborative partners, because they essentially bring their own friends to the conversation. And part of this system, which I work within, is of course connected to the art market. The art market runs, I would say, in parallel to the art world or to artistic production. In some cases, museums are inherently reliant on the resources of the art market to produce exhibitions with artists and to provide the means for artists to carry on with their work. And now we sort of slowly see a shift towards the art market being involved in research and production and discourse. Various commercial spaces are now offering artistic residencies. They're employing previously employed institutional curators and art historians. So I think in the future we'll also see various shifts occurring there. And of course, coming from the United Kingdom, the relationship between various museums and universities is a new trend and a new collaborative way of working, but this is also reliant on sharing resources. So you have previous ways of working where universities would work in collaboration with a museum on a project. However, now you're really looking at how the university is basically providing the content and the resources in order to enact the project. And this wasn't the case even 10 years ago. I think one of the other questions that Maja and I discussed was future development. I think we are at the cusp of a digital turn. If we're using turns to have our conversations today, we mentioned the educational turn earlier on, and we need to engage in online content with audiences, and this has to be a hybrid range of both online and offline content. I think using the term content here is really important. This is obviously used in marketing and comms, but this is how most of us experience the world, through various ways of reading or watching, or this is how we experience this. And I think the Walker Art Museum in Minneapolis in the US is one of the most interesting examples of how their content is shared across different platforms and to different audiences. So if you go on their website, you can read various articles, you can watch videos, you can engage in the exhibitions, even though we are nowhere near the wherever it is in Minneapolis. I mean, it's pretty hard to get to. Another area that I wanted to discuss was the practical changes in how we work. Previously, one of the ways that we engage in research, or the way that we share ideas, is reliant on international travel. And this is, or rather in the past, it was possible to travel to see an exhibition or to attend a conference or a talk, but now this has been greatly reduced, or that this doesn't happen. So I just wonder how this will shift in the future if we do need to make those trips, if we do need to experience things in person, or if this will also move entirely online. And I also wonder how artistic production will be impacted by this. Artists are, of course, based wherever they live or they work. However, the local context, I think, during the pandemic has become of particular importance. And I also think it's the responsibility of the museum to engage in this a lot more, and to really support this. I think many museums are always presenting programs that have an emphasis on the international. So, one example of this is that you might invite an artist to come and do a project or a talk that has their own expertise or their own ideas, and they might be based somewhere else in the world, yet you might have the same expertise where you live, but you don't want to tap into this because they're not international. And I think this really has to change, and we have to look at what's happening around us and work more in partnership as well with local context. I think for me, as a new curator in this Zurich arts scene, one of the things I've been doing in the last few weeks is visiting project spaces, visiting with artists, and really trying to see how there might be ways in the future for us to collaborate on program and move areas of our work outside into different physical spaces. A really big concern that I have is this idea of business as usual. I listened to a talk last week by various museum directors, and the sort of gist of the conversation was that once this is over, we'll go back to our old models and we'll continue this global narrative that we've all been part of. But I think we really have to reflect on this carefully and see what we can achieve in the future and how we can move into other ways of working. Obviously, the sort of key example here is the biennial, and this has also been linked to artistic production, and that artists are often invited to work with international biennials because this is one of the means where they have to produce new work, because they have the resources to produce this. So it's this also has to move in new ways in the future. And then scale. I think the scale of museums and the expanse of the museum in the last 20 to 30 years has been incredible. I think the amount of new museums that have opened or the amount of new infrastructures that have emerged is incredible. And I just wonder if this expanse will continue in the same way. Organizations like Tate have grown to be one of the most visited museums in the world, attracting millions of audiences every year. But the model around this and how this works in terms of supporting the institution has, of course, now created some serious problems, because those visitors aren't coming to the museum. They often might come to the museum just to have a look at the architecture or to have some coffee or whatever. But this model now, we've seen a massive decline in this. And I think, just to end on briefly, I think we all have to believe in our local artistic community and our local neighborhoods. I think we have to see what kind of creative practices are being explored, and we have to be open to this. We can't continue to only invite artists that are based in other parts of the world. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I think that both of your presentation, they kind of complement each other, and I'm thankful for that. What I would like to stress in the context of this conference that is dedicated to the different political possibilities of the art world, meaning the equity of the art world. In one of Paul's texts before, I would read that the curatorial, in the Adornian sense, does not want to fully reveal itself. So my question to both of you would be, do you think that the 2020 paradigm shift has revealed the true nature of the institutional and the curatorial, and revealed the new potentials of the curatorial? So that this potential of revealing the conditions of our existence in the art world is why I entitled this session Stripped Bare and Stripped Down and Cracked Open. So do you think that the 2020 really revealed something or not?
Do you want to take that on first?
I can just respond briefly. I would say, yes, it did reveal. I think precarity would be the biggest thing that comes to mind here, and how artists are reliant on support from the state and from other organizations in order to survive. I mean, not only to produce artwork, but just to live and exist. And it's interesting looking around the world how different countries are now trying to support artists. So I think in Germany, the government announced, I don't know, 200 billion euros, was it, to support artists and art institutions? Whereas in the United Kingdom, this is basically to give a little bit of money to support pre-existing institutions and not really support individual artists. I think in the last 10 years, we've seen in some countries, artists have created unions and have tried to implement support structures for equal pay. And I think this has to step up a gear. I think we have to support artists and other creative workers if we're to continue existing. It also, I guess it also shows how scarcely resourced institutions are as well. And of course, I'm speaking from an institutional perspective. I'm not working as an independent curator, but you know, people who work in institutions as well, also many have a pretty precarious existence.
Paul, what's your take on this?
I think it's I have maybe multiple contradictory responses to that question. Ultimately, I think it's as Michael indicated in his kind of concluding comments about business as usual. I think it's too early and too easy to create a synopsis or a knee-jerk reaction to the last few months, where if anything, it's shown how quickly the right, the hard right, the fascist regimes, how quickly they were able to mobilize in a way. It was how difficult it was perhaps for the left to mobilize and stick itself to any kind of institutional change. And I'm perhaps also including things like Black Lives Matter and Me Too, Next Generation, and various other initiatives which are of fundamental importance, but have yet to kind of be translated into kind of institutional sovereignty in a way. I think the vulnerability of the art world is also very apparent, particularly for small to medium scale organizations, and even to larger scale organizations that are at the whim of a patron or funder or governing agency. It showed how so many of the institutions that we categorize as stable are kind of are dependent on a single source of income. Similarly, how dependent artists and independent curators are on those institutions to support their very survival. So if you think about it from the top down, because that's what's crumbling around us, the foundations are being removed from underneath our feet, but at the same time, the scaffolding above our heads is falling down at the same time. So you have this squash in the middle. And in a way, this squash in the middle really demands some kind of reprofiling of the kind of political debates around what are institutions in themselves there to do. And the quote that you introduced this conversation about, the idea of the Adornian sense of separation between the inside and the outside. What has been shown in the last few months is that, as Andrea Fraser has said for many years, as has Ito Sterl and others, is that the inside and the outside, those distinctions between those who produce art and those who organize art are indistinguishable increasingly. I think the conflation of race and environmental change and late capitalism is also difficult to ascertain. Like everything's been kind of squashed together, from trans rights to the rights of LGBTQI communities in Poland and Hungary and elsewhere, to Black activists in America, and without really looking more closely at the kind of structural fault lines in the way in which power works specifically in America, specifically in Poland, Hungary, and so forth. And even though over the last 20, 30 years, we've been calling, certainly within those who've been critical of the dominance of certain institutional formats and frameworks, have been calling for a decentralizing of power and a reimagining of power otherwise. What we see is in Europe and in the States is that with this decentralizing that's already happening, is that there is no unifying force coming together to lead the way. I mean, you can see that within the kind of the weakness of governance within the United States of America in relation to the globe. You can also see how dictatorial and fascistic regimes seem to be very responding to the immediate needs and fears of those who are marching the streets without thinking, And I think that this is it's just a reification and a reminder, a reaffirmation of how far away the left and right are from each other to coming together to even agree on what the terms of engagement are. Never mind what the political differences are, because they're constantly being exposed over and over again. So it's a very, very complicated question that you've asked, and I think that's what has, to looking at the positive elements of it, what we have seen is a kind of a reinstituting and reaffirmation of an investment in human traits such as generosity, such as care, such as looking after, and so on and so forth. But this is currently still kind of a rhetoric of change rather than the production of change. So marching the streets with all of our, all of our friends of color and all of the other Black activists and queer activists and trans activists that we kind of like, that we love and care for is not enough. And it's also, when you see how quickly technology developed in 4 to 5 months, there are possibilities that the time can be accelerated. Development and change can be accelerated if there is a centralized will to do so, which we've seen with certainly within digital technology, and the need the need and the necessity for these two things to kind of develop in tandem over the last few months. I mean, who knew of Zoom in January 2020, for example?
Absolutely. All these things that both of you mentioned seem to be only an aperitivo, and it seems that another publication would be on its way in 2021, because there are so many different things to reflect upon. But because we're very limited with time, I just want to include briefly one question from the audience. And this is like, if you can answer briefly, because we're running out of time, can both Michael and Paul say something more about what it means for curating? How will paradigm of curating change with the digital content, or the digital turn, I would say? Do you think that it's changed the practices of curating, the digital turn?
I mean, it shows how fast again technology has been able to work, but also like Michael pointed to, some of the initiatives such as the ICA in London and Blue Coat and the Walker, and then you can add to that things like Nottingham Contemporary and other institutions that have really developed quite interesting digital platforms, reminding us that how much we leaned on, and how all of us leaned on culture and on arts during the last few months in order to nourish us and keep us alive, never mind to keep us quenched of thirst and to feed our bodies, and all of those other things that went to stay alive and being able to breathe easily. All of those things were in tandem with a reaffirmation of how important all of these things are, and also how digital platforms do create different kinds of audiences, and also different kind of audiences that I would say are, post-internet, are networking and socializing very differently. At Publix, we're developing a young person's advisory board for Publix as a way of trying to rethink our content and how we use non-art affirming platforms to bring people together, meaning that do people need to know everything that we know in order to engage with us around what constitutes the relationship between art and society and so forth. But I think it has changed, but also, as Michael said, and I think what the Liliana is maybe referencing is what's different between digital platforms and the in-person real experience of contemporary art. So if you think about art just as a commodity or something that moves from one sphere to another, the art fairs and the various other mechanisms that have used digital platforms have been able to succeed in translating that capital into an image and then translated into the same amount of money in the real life experience. But museums and other larger institutions have yet to do that, with the exception of somewhere like the Walker or Nottingham, and maybe what Michael's doing in Zurich. So yeah,
I mean, just to add to that, I think we also need to reskill. I think there's a lot that we need to learn as curators. Actually, we're actually undergoing quite a big project now called Digitorials. We're working in partnership with 10 other museums, and this project actually started pre-pandemic, but the timing is just brilliant. So it's a whole project that looks at the digital experience of audiences, and of course the pandemic has really spurred that along quite nicely. But we're all kind of, I'm attending workshops on various methods of engagement, how we can use videos much more interestingly, in terms of, you don't just record a talk, but you do a kind of interactive event. There's a lot that we have to learn, and I think speaking in my previous role at Tate, there was a big reluctance and also a bit of fear about opening up this into sort of digital audiences and what this means for our existing audiences. So there's still a great deal that we have to learn. Could we
talk about that, Michael, about that project another time?
Yeah, let's talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, we've actually just hired. Well, we're in the process of hiring a digital curator, and we don't know what the term is yet, but we're working with 2 advisors, one from the US and one from the UK, to help us rethink digital curating, but also is there a kind of a third way? Is there a third way somewhere between the public gathering of people and the digital gathering of people? But is there something else maybe in between these two that's not just like bringing in a film crew and making it all very interesting and TV-like in the kind of hybrid way in which Zoom kind of works? But is there a third way? And that may be also about connecting with other knowledges and skills elsewhere. I agree with that. It has shown how vulnerable my own knowledge is in relation, and all of our knowledge in relation to this. So
I think in the States they refer to this position as of a digital storyteller.
Yeah.
So we have our narratives, but I just hope that we will also pay attention to the politics at stakes of the storytelling, because it has to be more serious, because we are fighting a battle here. I would say in the art world, it seems to me that this is a chance for the smaller institutions also to promote their narratives. They can become more visible than they were before, and because they were used to a crisis even before this pandemics, they are more responsive and I would say that more experimental, and they deal with the daily reality of a crisis and precarity. So I would say that this year was a chance for them to promote the content within the wider audiences, and because also, as I mentioned in one of the presentations before, they seem to be lower. They were not in this high end of the art world. They were lower, and when the fall hit, when they felt the fall was they hit. It was not a hard hit as it is for the bigger institution who were high up, and then the fall was it hit them harder. So it's just the metaphor that I use to understand what's going on with the small scale or the intermediate section of the art world. But as Arthur Kastner, the author, said, we are all yogis and commissaries in this spectrum. So either we will be yogis or we will be commissaries. Yogis, they try to change the world from within, and the commissaries, they try to change the world. They make a revolution outside. And this is a year of strange circumstances. But I hope that we will have a chance to continue this conversation in another occasion and in another context, because obviously there is interest in it. And before we leave, I would like to kindly ask you to look at the comments in the sessions, because some of the participants were active and they were grateful for your contributions. We will promote these great presentations within the wider channel after the conference. And so I'm super grateful to have you here, and until we meet again.